Welcome to the Judy Leigh Allen Mexico Center podcast. I'm Tony Payan, Director of the Center for the U.S. and Mexico at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy in Houston, Texas. I will be joined today in conversation with Carlos Bravo Regidor, a political analyst and media outlets Reforma, Expansión Política, Gatopardo, ForoTV, and Radio Fórmula. We'll talk about some of the key challenges and issues that will face Mexico's next presidential administration after the June 2nd elections in 2024. Carlos, welcome to this podcast at the Mexico Center. Thank you for joining us.
No, thank you for having me, Tony. It's such a pleasure to be here.
So on June 2nd, Mexico has an election, and here we are. The polls show a certain favorite, Claudia Sheinbaum, who was handpicked by President López Obrador, and the opposition has nominated a woman. It's a coalition behind Xochitl Gálvez. What can we expect on June 2nd? How is the election coming up?
Well, the most likely scenario seems to be that Claudia Sheinbaum will win by a comfortable margin. I think if things continue as they have been so far, it must be said that this electoral process has been incredibly stable in terms of the preferences. So if it continues like this, Claudia Sheinbaum will probably win by an advantage of between 15 or 25 points. Her coalition might be close enough or even get the absolute majority of seats in Congress, a majority that will help her approve her yearly budgets or make reforms to the laws, but not to change the Constitution. And in terms of the governorships, there are 9 governorships at play, and Morena will almost surely keep at least 3. In the other 6, there might be more competition. This is interesting because on the one hand, it seems to be a victory of López Obrador. It seems to signal that there is a majoritarian appetite for continuity at the federal level. But at the local level, this is the first time that Morena has to go back to the polls. And this might signal that at the local level, Morena is not going to do as well as at the federal level.
Yeah. The polls are everywhere. I mean, you see massive color, with differences of anywhere between 4 and 6 points between the two front runners. And then some polls show much larger margins. What's going on with the polls? I mean, obviously, they failed everywhere. They failed in Turkey. They failed in Argentina. They failed in many different places. And they failed in the United States, too. And obviously in Mexico, I don't know what to believe. The spread among the different polls is all over the place.
Well, when you talk to pollsters in Mexico, they tend to give you a two-pronged answer, so to speak. On the one hand, they are having field problems because of insecurity, because of concerns with criminal activity, and, the fact that a lot of people do not want to be polled, do not open the door, do not answer. There's that. There's also the fact that many people are afraid to talk. There tends to be a bias towards whoever is in power. Pollster was telling me the other day that, discount about 8% because of that bias. But those are regular problems. The other problem is that polls have become a propaganda instrument for many campaigns. And this tends to generate a certain discredit of their instrument in terms of generating certain levels of certainty regarding the result. At the end of the day, though, the very spread of the polls tells me that not all of them are wrong. Some might be better than others. The problem is we don't know which ones, or we won't know which ones. But I tend to rely on certain polls, on certain, polling houses more than in others. And those are the ones I really try to keep an eye on while not paying too much attention to the other ones.
Yeah. Now, tell me a little bit about the situation, for example, in states like Guerrero or Tierra Caliente in Michoacan and places like that, where folks may not even be able to vote. I mean, organized crime is playing a role there. Can there be electoral fraud in certain spots in the country? I'm thinking Guerrero specifically is a good example where organized crime might actually influence the election, stuff the ballot boxes, intervene actively in intimidating candidates or buying votes and so on. Is this really a reliable election? Can we say that the election will be fairly clean, free, and fair, given all these different variables in various parts of the country?
Well, I think we can say it's relatively free. Fair and clean, I don't know. Particularly regarding the participation of organized crime, I think organized crime has become a veto player in the Mexican electoral process, particularly at the local level, where criminal organizations really need a racket, really need political protection in order to operate. So they are intervening in terms of deciding who can run and who can't. And they threaten candidates, they kill candidates, they make them or submit or pull from the race. And this really puts at risk Mexican democracy because it means that Mexicans cannot elect whoever they want, that criminal organizations are having a hand in the selection of the candidates. More than on who wins, is on who runs, who's able to run, who's allowed to run. But this also speaks to another problem that's not only democracy, but it's the state itself. It's the fact that Mexican authorities cannot guarantee the safety of Mexicans, the integrity of the electoral process, and cannot exert their legitimate, monopoly on violence upon people who act well beyond the limits of the law, and there are no consequences.
That's a very important thing that you mentioned, free and fair elections. So they may be somewhat free. I mean, Mexicans are going to go to the polls and they're going to vote the way they're going to vote, probably in the privacy of the polling booth. However, fair. The president has been intervening constantly in this election, has been sanctioned 70 times by the INE, and there is obviously mobilization of public resources in favor of Morena and things like that. So it's clearly not, they sort of thumbed the scale. So it's not a completely fair election. But that speaks to the institutions. What's the condition of the INE, the National Electoral Institute, which organizes the elections, and of course a tribunal, which is supposed to sanction those that might interfere with the elections, and obviously powerless because they've actually admonished the president 70 times, and the president keeps doing that. Where are we in terms of the institutions in Mexico?
Well, this is a problem that we didn't have anymore. The Mexican transition to democracy process was, built upon the creation of an impartial, independent, professional electoral authority to take elections away from the hands of government and have this sort of, as they called, constitutional organization that was dependent, that was autonomous. And, that was a huge success. For a long time, INE was a worldwide example of how a country could really become democratic by having an electoral bureaucracy that organized elections, that counted the votes. But since 2006, when López Obrador lost the presidency by an incredibly slim margin, he sort of launched this campaign against INE, saying it had been a fraud, that he had been, stolen the election. It was sort of what we could call López Obrador's big lie. This sort of sore loser politics where he did not accept the result. He blamed his opponents. He blamed electoral authorities. Ever since then, the reputation of INE has suffered. And since he became president, these attacks have become a lot more aggressive and a lot more frequent. The people running INE have changed during López Obrador's administration, and the people who have come have not been really the best. I wouldn't say that the INE is captured, politically captured, but I think something has happened in terms of a deprofessionalization of it. A lot of people who used to work there have left, and we're starting to see signals that the election is not managed as professionally and as flawlessly as it used to. I'm worried about that more than in other things regarding the performance of electoral authorities in this process.
Let me go back to the candidates and the coalitions. Each of them, and I'm not talking about the MC candidate, Álvarez Maínez, who's probably not going to win, and certainly, he's still there on the stage, but, who knows what's going to happen with him. I'm talking about the two front runners. They bring something. Each coalition brings something to the table. Each candidate brings something to the table. Where are their weaknesses? Where are their strengths?
I would say that Claudia Sheinbaum's most important strength is the fact that she has been able to incarnate the appetite for continuity that a majority of Mexican voters seem to have regarding López Obrador. She has become his candidate, their candidate, and that is really pulling her through. At the same time, there is a weakness in representing continuity because it becomes a straitjacket that prevents her from recognizing things that need to change.
It's very tough to defend the record that López Obrador is leaving.
Exactly, particularly in issues such as corruption or such as security. Claudia Sheinbaum cannot say that this needs to be corrected because that would short-circuit the message of continuity she's running with. So this is a weakness because her relationship with reality is strange. Because on the one hand, you can tell that some things do not need a second floor, as she promises, the second floor of the transformation. It is the first floor that needs to be taken care of. But she can't come out and say that. So that's a weakness of her candidacy. Now, regarding Xochitl Gálvez, I think her main strength is the fact that her relationship with reality is more normal. She can actually recognize the things that the government has done right much more than Claudia can recognize the things that the López Obrador administration has done wrong. She can speak the truth, so to speak. But at the same time, she is running on a platform with parties that used to compete against each other, that used to think of each other as adversaries. And now they're all together, supporting her. It's very hard, not only in terms of dealing with the party machines, with the leader, but even with voters themselves. These voters, were used to compete with each other. I think Xochitl Gálvez is really having to pull a very difficult maneuver in terms of bringing together those parties, at the same time trying not to bring the discredit that these parties have with a majority of the electorate, these old traditional parties that for many people represent an old political class they want to do away with. Xochitl wants the voters of these parties to own her candidacy, to make her theirs, but at the same time she needs to protect herself from the bad reputation these parties have. I think that's her most important weakness.
Yeah. Tell me the role that the MC, the Citizens Movement Party, is playing. They have a candidate. They didn't go with the coalition behind Xochitl Gálvez. They decided to go on their own. They're polling about 4%, 5%, 6%, no more than that. And there are some signs that they may be operating with Mr. López Obrador. There's some things that are going on. They've certainly been very critical of Xochitl Gálvez. Are they the spoiler? Can they make a difference at all? Or is it just a third candidate simply not going to make a difference?
That was a concern before the campaign started, that they might play sort of a disloyal third wheel here and end up dividing the opposition vote. The way the campaign has played out, I think, has dispelled those concerns because the difference between Claudia Sheinbaum and Xochitl Gálvez is so big that, that 4, 5, 6% that Movimiento Ciudadano might get makes no difference. It used to matter more when their candidate was Samuel García, the governor of Nuevo León, who had to step down because he could not manage, the process of his substitution as governor properly. The local Congress of Nuevo León was going to elect somebody he didn't trust, he didn't like, he didn't appoint. He ended up just leaving the candidacy, leaving MC without a candidate. That was a mess. That was seen as really unprofessional, amateurish, very bad politics. And, Álvarez Maínez came a bit to try to save the day for Movimiento Ciudadano, but from a position of weakness because he's not as well known as the governor of Nuevo León. So, to be honest, I think his mission is to keep the voting of MC above or around 5%. And if he does that, he will have accomplished this very ungrateful task that the party commissioned him with after a terrible management of the collapse of the first candidate they wanted. I think Movimiento Ciudadano plays a different game. It's trying to build a third alternative in a scenario that is very polarized. A lot of people in the opposition see them as accomplices of Morena because they're supposedly dividing the opposition vote. I'm not sure that's the case. I think some voters for Movimiento Ciudadano, if they couldn't vote for it, would vote for Morena, and others would vote for the opposition. I don't think it's that straightforward, to be frank.
Now, there is one question floating in the air, which I think is really important, and that is the role that organized crime will play. We know that organized crime in Mexico under the López Obrador administration has grown enormously to occupy cities and sectors in cities and roads and rural areas and various aspects of the economy. So they're fully embedded now. And I think there's a concern that they have discovered that they're not just a business, dark business, a black business, but that they have political interests. We know also that they seem to have played a role in the 2021 elections in the Pacific Coast. What role will they play in this election?
Well, their presence is so ubiquitous, and the chunks of the territory they have, control over are so big that they are going to have to play a role because they have political interest, particularly in having politicians that will find agreements with them. I think organized crime is happy, relatively happy, with the policy that this government has deployed, with the security policy. I know the slogan, hogs not bullets, where, it was supposedly necessary to tackle the problem differently, not through violence, but through social programs. This had a long-term perspective that the fruits of which we have not seen, but it meant an abandonment of, the population at the hands of organized crime. So I think there is an interest in criminal organizations for Morena to do well. And as you said, in the 2021 elections in the states of the Pacific, there is plenty of journalistic evidence that criminal organizations operated in favor of Morena candidates. And where Morena is not that strong, they will play with whoever is, poised to win. It is not that they have a party in itself. It is that they want to be in cahoots with whoever is the strongest candidate, strongest party. And Morena is the strongest party in many places, so they deal with Morena. And I think Morena has come to accept this situation. What this ends up leaving us is in a very dark place of political resignation, of political responsibility, of, the government failing to fulfill its basic role of providing security and rule of law to the population.
Now, let me ask you a question about the dynamics of the election in a vertical sort of way. We know that all politics is local. We know that Mexicans often split their ticket and they vote anywhere between 7 and 12% for different parties. The same person that votes for a particular party at the presidency votes for a different party at the local level. So there's a lot of ticket splitting going on and a lot of strategic thinking, even though we think that often people just vote unthinkingly. But there is a lot of strategy to it. Who will pull whom? Will the local candidates, especially given the fact that the opposition seems to have postulated some really good candidates at the local level for the most part, and Morena has actually picked up a lot of difficult candidates, so to speak, problematic candidates to some extent. So will Sheinbaum carry the day at the local level, or will the local level have its own logic and therefore influence somewhat, if not completely, the national election?
Well, I think we have two dynamics at play here. In presidential systems, federal presidential elections do generate coattail effects upon local elections or legislative elections. But at the same time, we do have a lot of evidence that the Mexican process of transition to democracy moved from the periphery to the center, from the bottom to the top. So I have a hard time deciding which is going to be stronger. I think, and added the fact that a lot of Morena governors are going to, prove themselves for the first time in a second electoral cycle, and people are going to be able to punish them if they don't like them. The fact that in at least 3 states governed by Morena, it seems that the opposition might win, or that at least it's competitive enough to raise doubts about if Morena can win in Veracruz, in Mexico City, and in Morelos. This sort of brings me to an answer that is very, unsatisfactory, which is it depends. It depends on the state. It depends on who governs the state. If we're going to have a pull effect from the local to the federal or, vice versa. I don't think we can generalize in that regard. As you said, every local election has its own dynamics. And, in consequence, the interplay between the federal election and the local election will only be decided case by case, so to speak.
In the United States, we have 12 million people born in Mexico, Mexican citizens. I'm not talking about those whose parents were born in Mexico, whose grandparents were born in Mexico, and who could potentially go to the consulate and claim a Mexican passport. I'm talking about folks that were born in Mexico, they're Mexican citizens by birth, and could potentially vote in the election. 12 million. There's always been a lack of interest in Mexico's elections, but it's been growing. 60,000 in one election, and then 90,000 in the last election, and now 226,000 people registered to vote. And yet the INE suddenly took off the roster 40,000, almost 40,000 of those folks who had expressed some interest in voting in this election. What's going on? Why is the electoral system in Mexico so inefficient, old, unable, incapable of integrating the political will of all the Mexicans that live in the United States?
Well, I think there are two answers to your question. The first one is regarding the voting of Mexicans abroad. I think the system was designed not to really integrate them in significant numbers. It was more symbolic than anything else. It takes a lot. It requires a lot for somebody to be able to vote from abroad. And the way the policy was, this is not a bug, it's a feature. The policy was designed in a way to say, okay, so now Mexicans can vote abroad, but in a way that didn't really create a significant electorate outside of Mexico City. I think that the political class did not want that to happen. And what you were saying about people being disenfranchised, I think this is a reflection of what I was saying earlier about the deprofessionalization of the electoral authority. I don't think this is something that's being done deliberately. I think this is something that's just happening because the people who used to run these offices or these programs have left and amateurs have taken over. It's worrisome. It's a matter of concern because people who live abroad and who have the right to vote might not be able to do so. But again, unfortunately, the way this was legislated in the first place makes the size of this electorate very small to make a difference in the final result.
Yeah, but in the election of 2006, the difference was 244,000 votes. Mexicans in the United States could potentially make a difference if they registered in sufficient numbers in a very close election.
Which is not the case in this election.
Right, it's not the case. Well, Carlos, has been wonderful. I hope our listeners learned quite a bit about the Mexican election coming up on June 2nd. I thank you for joining us in this podcast today. Thanks so much.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you for having me, Tony.
The Judy Leigh Allen Mexico Center podcast is brought to you by the Baker Institute Center for the U.S. and Mexico, which seeks to have a meaningful impact on the U.S.-Mexico relationship through binational policy research and solutions, and by convening leaders who can bridge the world of ideas and the world of action. Special thanks to Judy Leigh Allen for her generous support of the work that we do here at the center, and to Lisa Wakita, our program manager.